1962 was a grim year for steam locomotives, for it was the year that the 1955 Modernization Act would become more prevalent. It was to take place over the course of 15 years, and its ultimate plan was to eliminate steam traction once and for all. With electrification on the East Coast Main Line, Birmingham, Central Scotland, and Kent being outlined, some of the BR standard steam locomotives had only worked for 5 years when these changes took effect. Spring had come quickly in the year of 1962 in the South, and Gilbert was talking quite grimly to one of the War Department 280s that visited sometimes.
I'll tell you, Gilbert, the situation's not good. Most of them are only a few years old, and they only just ceased production. Workers reckon we will all be scrapped by the end of the decades thanks to this.
Have faith, young one. There's always another plan, another scheme. They will soon realize their mistake when engines like us end up on the deadline. The workload will soon get larger and larger.
He tried to give a smile of encouragement.
But it will take more than the government to get rid of us completely. Mark my words, Riddles.
If you say so. But you'll be up first then. Your design has been around since pre-grouping. If I weren't looking at you right now, I'd say you're a myth, but here you are talking to me with about 15 years between us.
Oh, age. Age is no limit. But I've come back from the edge many times.
Might not next time.
He warned.
I saw a tank engine being taken apart on the siding the other night.
On the siding?
Yep. He burst one of the cylinders, and he was finished. You could hear the screams from miles away. The torches were not merciful to save
The foreman shouted out something to the rails' driver, and he pulled off.
I hope we meet again, Gilbert.
Well, I do too, old friend. I do too.
Winston returned later that evening when the weather began to turn to crap. Oh wow, I don't envy going out in this weather.
Well, don't envy me then. Felix is late with the last train of the day, so I must take his goods.
Be careful out there tonight, Gilbert. I know you will, but still. A little extra safety never hurt anyone. Gilbert nodded and went to go find his wagon to the yard. Meanwhile, on the line after the junction, a midnight train bound for Radmoore had been stopped. The engine at the front was impatient and complained loudly.
Oh, this weather is horrible. It ruined my brand new coat.
The driver agreed and went back into the cab.
Not very talkative today, huh?
The driver did not reply, only talking to the fireman. The wind was blowing hard and Gilbert was trying his best to keep a grip on the rails. He could barely see through the fog, but just he kept going, thinking that he was clear for the rest of the run. Now, the disgruntled engine's boiler pressure was able to rise again, but there was another problem. The brakes were sticking on most of the cars, and he was not happy.
Oh, so that's how it is.
Trust me, Lucy, and we're trying our best to sort this out as quickly as we can. And the crew went along the train manually releasing the brakes. Gilbert was speeding up on the downward gradient towards the junction. He whistled as he passed the station as per regulations. The loco heard the whistle and shouted to his driver.
Come on now, there's another train meant to be coming after us. We needed to keep going.
The driver looked up and went pale as a ghost when he saw Gilbert and scrambled back into the cab and opened the throttle hastily. The 700's glass wheels began to move, but the rails were slippery. The train was heavy. Gilbert went over the curve and saw the lamp of the brake rail with the guard waving the flag. Look out! The engineer shouted, but there was no chance of stopping in time. All was quiet, except for the clanking of the 700's glass pulling away what remained of the train. Winston and Shaw were sleeping in the shed when they heard a strange sounding bell. A bell that Winston had never heard before, and stopped within a few minutes. What's all that racket about?
Oh, that's the emergency bell. There must have been an accident somewhere.
Winston watched concerned as Liam passed under the signal gantry with the crane.
You know, the last time I heard that bell was back in 1943. It was one of my siblings.
They stayed up all night to tell Gilbert about it, but Gilbert did not return. That morning, Winston awoke with a start to find an engine backing down next to him that he had never seen before. The engine was of southern origin and looked rather glum. "Oh, hello there. Do you know about the accident last night?" Lucian looked at Winston and sighed.
Know about it? My train was one that was hit. I spent the early morning hours clearing the wreckage with one of your standard fives.
Winston couldn't put his buffer on it. But the only train running at that time was Felix's, and he didn't make it back in time.
So I heard, but the manager reassigned another engine.
Shaw had just woken up, and had just caught wind of the situation and was keeping quiet.
All I can say is that they got the poor bloke on the flatbed and took him away ASAP.
Winston didn't want to look, but once he did, he could think of nothing to say. There, at the end of a rig of a few wagons, was a bruised northeastern tender, battered and quite alone.
I'm so sorry, guys.
He said to Winston, who looked away. Shaw moved further out of the shed and comforted the 700 class.
It's okay, it was not your fault. But, you best get back home, little fellow. Your friends, I'm sure, must be worried.
Lucian puffed away sadly to prepare for his train back to Nine Elms. Shaw wanted to stay and speak to Winston, but the first train of the day was due, and he later left. And quiet in the yard stood the wrecked northeastern tender. As the weeks passed by, the tender disappeared. Where exactly? Nobody wanted to find out in fear of finding something even worse. The yard had acquired 2 new locomotives, one to stay permanently while the other was temporary. The first one was named Charles. He was a Welsh goods engine of class 2251. He could sometimes be snappy, but he was hard-working and meant well, hauling freight in and out of the industrial park. The other engine was called Robert, who was an ex-LBS and CRD4 tank engine, and on the outside he was very grumpy, but he did his best to do his work without fuss. To Liam's delight, he was a football fan, and they talked endlessly into the night about bad catches, handballs, and the rowdy patrons that would often frequent the stadiums. Winston, meanwhile, found himself alone all the time and tried his best to stay away from the other engines. One day, in early August, Winston found himself up at Radmoore with all the engines. "What's going on? Shouldn't you have all left by now?" "Well, Mr. Nolan has given us extra 5 minutes. He said we all might like this." Winston was confused. Well, what could be so damn important? But as he asked, a faint whistle sounded in the distance, and everyone went silent. Then, out of the morning haze, the shape of a tender appeared, followed by an engine. Winston couldn't believe his eyes. Could it be? It was not, however, Gilbert the green engine. It was Gilbert the black engine.
Good morning, chaps. How's it been?
Winston was shocked by all of this. "But we thought that you were scrapped."
I was quite close to it though, but it's nice to know that I have a manager who values his engines. Do you lads like my new paint? They just applied it last night. Why, my dear Gilbert, you look absolutely smashing. Why, I must have a washdown. For the engines who wear the crest of British Railways must stand proud together.
Aye, laddie, perhaps you wish you kept your old paint. Right on, Charles, right on. Winston, meanwhile, found himself alone all the time and tried to... You know what, sometimes I just want to rip my fucking foreskin off.